everyone, welcome to today's video. I hope that you're all doing well and enjoying your first few days of spring. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how I made this DIY dress form. So I've literally had this project on my to-do list for so long. I think I bought the materials for it like over a year ago, so I finally got around to it. So in this video, I'm going to show you everything from what supplies you need to how I actually put this together and what steps were involved in order to get this finished product. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to discuss whether or not I think it was worth it to make my own versus buying a professional dress form. But first, let's chat about why you might want to DIY a dress form in the first place instead of just buying one. So in my mind, there are two main reasons why you'd want to make your own dress form. And the first of those is cost. So professionally made dress forms are quite expensive, ranging anywhere from like a couple of $100s to over $1,000. So making one yourself could theoretically be worth it if you're on a budget and looking to save some money. But theoretically is the operative word here because I actually spent quite a bit of money making this dress form. And at the end of the video, I'm going to do a total breakdown of how much it actually cost me to make this, as well as how intensive the process was to really decide whether or not this was a worthwhile project instead of just investing in a professional one. Reason number two why you might want to make your own dress form is sizing. So because this dress form is custom, it is tailored to exactly my measurements. Dress forms from professional suppliers usually follow what's called like standard industry measurements, and a lot of the times these don't offer any room for like customization or anything like that. And on top of that, from just doing a quick like cursory Google, a lot of the size ranges that I did find in professional dress forms were pretty limited. I personally don't fit into like the average standard size. I don't think that a lot of people do. Every body is different, so having a dress form that is exactly your size and shape is definitely a benefit to making one yourself. So let's go ahead and jump into the process and see how to actually make this thing, and then I will see you on the other side. So the first thing that I did was order my pattern, and the one that I got is from a company called Bootstrap Fashion. This video isn't sponsored by them, but I am an affiliate with them, so I'll place my link in the description box below if you end up ordering from them and you'd like to support my channel. So they have a couple of options to choose from, but you want to make sure that you do the custom one and not the standard sizes. So for those you can choose between Missy and plus size, and I went with Missy for mine. Once in there, you can input all of your measurements. You can choose between inches and centimeters. I like to work in centimeters. And then you can go ahead and add your height and your bust, etc. They also have handy little infographics to show you exactly how to take the measurements because you want them to be as accurate as possible, so it's maybe a good idea to have a friend help you. Aside from your measurements, they also have some options for your general body shape and type which you can select from. They also have some optional measurements which you can add under the Fit Adjustments tab. I did these for mine, but they're not required. One thing you probably want to make sure to check is yes for seam allowance. This will just make sure that there's a 1 centimeter seam allowance included in all of your pattern pieces, which is what I'm used to. And then you can choose your pattern output. For this, I'm choosing print at home and print in letter size paper. So then once you place your order with them, their system will chug away for maybe 20 minutes, and then you'll get an email with your custom pattern that you can print at home, which I thought was really cool. My pattern came in a really long, narrow orientation, which was kind of funny, but it's put together like any other print-at-home pattern. And then you'll also receive the full detailed instructions for how to construct your dress form, as well as a list of supplies needed and recommendations on where you can get them. Starting with my supplies, I have this white fabric, which I thrifted for $8.50. It feels like maybe a mid-weight twill. I have two 7-inch zippers, which I also thrifted for the bottom closure. I have these two sponges. I couldn't find just one that was thick enough, so I bought two thinking that I could just stack them together. I have some cardboard from an old box, and then my woven fusible interfacing. I also purchased a bag of polyester stuffing for the fill. Finally, I have a length of PVC piping and a wooden rod to make the stand. So first I'm unraveling my thrifted outer fabric and throwing that in the laundry. And while that's being washed, I'm getting to work on assembling and cutting out my pattern. Once my fabric was washed and dried, I pressed it with steam to get all of the wrinkles out, and then laid out and pinned all of my pieces for cutting. I made sure to cut along the lines and into the notches as carefully as I could, as I wanted everything to line up as accurately as possible. After cutting all of the pieces out of my main fabric, I cut them again out of my interfacing, which I then ironed on. And the instructions actually say to interface your fabric before cutting, which probably would have been easier and faster, but I missed that, so I did it this way. While ironing on my interfacing, I realized that even though I washed my fabric, it had some discoloration in some spots, which it was annoying, but at the same time doesn't really matter for this project, and it wasn't really noticeable, so I decided to just leave it and not recut those pieces. For the internal stabilizer and pipe sleeve pieces, I used some mid-weight cotton muslin, which I have a huge length of in my stash and I normally use for pattern making, but it has a really nice stable weave, so I thought it would be perfect to use for this purpose. Lastly, I used a Sharpie to trace the base and armhole inserts onto my cardboard, and then my regular craft scissors were literally not cutting it, so I brought in the heavy-duty scissors to cut those out, and then to cut out the holes I used an X-Acto knife. One last thing that I almost forgot to do was marking the key measurement lines, so the bust line, under bust, waist, and hip. So I quickly traced those onto the wrong side of my pattern pieces using fabric chalk. So with all of my pieces cut out and all of my supplies gathered, we are ready to start sewing. Starting with the back pieces of the body, I pinned them together, matching the notches and lines, and then stitched at a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I then clipped into all of the seams to make sure the curves would lay flat, and pressed the seams open using steam. The front pieces have a few more steps because of the bust cups, which are first attached to the lower front sections, and then the upper chest and shoulder pieces are added. I used this hot pink thread to zigzag along the bottom of the bust cups using a width of 2 and a stitch length of 1. This just outlines them so that they're easier to see on the finished dress form. Then I continued assembling the rest of the fronts and attached the pieces to the back. Once it was all put together, I used pins to mark the right side of the fabric along those key lines that I had marked using chalk on the back. I used my same hot pink thread and a zigzag stitch to stitch along each of the bust, underbust, waist, and hip lines. Once that was all done, I was left with this piece, which was honestly starting to look a little bit familiar at this point. So here we are at about day 3, I think. And the next step was to sew the back and front shoulder seams together and then add the piece for the neck. Once that was attached, I stitched down the center back all in one go and made sure again to clip and press open all of my seams. While I was sewing the center back, I ran out of bobbin thread somewhere close to the top and just kept going, which always seems to be the way that it happens. Sometimes I just get so into the flow of working that I totally forget to check it. So anyway, once I wound that up again, I was able to finish that seam and keep going. Next came the somewhat tedious part of attaching the circular pieces for the neck and armholes. The instructions say to clip into the neck and shoulders before pinning, but I found that I was able to work them in without clipping, and just made sure that I used a lot of pins and stitched slowly and carefully, and adjusted my fabric as I needed to ensure that there weren't any puckers. For the armhole inserts, I started pinning the stabilizer to my armholes around the bottom, and then I inserted the cardboard pieces before pinning the rest to enclose it. I found this pretty tricky to stitch because the cardboard added a really thick layer to stitch beside, so I found it easiest to use a zipper foot, and then I could make sure that my stitching line was as close as possible to the cardboard. So with that done, here is where I was at. She's almost finished at this point, looking maybe a little bit deflated, but we're going to remedy that soon. So next it's time to make the internal stabilizer and pipe sleeve. I started by stitching my pipe sleeve down both long edges at a 1 centimeter seam allowance from the top folded edge to the bottom. And then I made sure that it was able to glide easily over the pipe, which it did, but if not, I could have adjusted it here. I cut these little fringes at the bottom, which are going to be used to secure it later on, and then I pinned and stitched the front and back stabilizer pieces to the pipe sleeve, making sure to match the notches so that everything lined up well. Once the pieces were all attached, I pressed them away from the pipe sleeve and pinned them, and then stitched over them in a random pattern to add even more stability to the fabric. And here is what the internal piece looked like once it was all finished. So then I needed to attach it to the main outer body piece along the center, front, and back seams. So when doing this, I made sure that the seams were both pressed open and the center seam lines were lined up, and then I just stitched right over the previous line of stitching to secure them together. And then again, I made sure to clip into all of the curved seams to make sure that they would lie flat. Next, I needed to cut the sponges for the neck insert, so I started by trimming the seam allowance off of my neck pattern piece, and then pinning that to my sponge and using my heavy-duty scissors to cut it out. And I actually ended up just piecing together the scraps from the first sponge to use as the second layer, so that I could keep the second sponge for cleaning around the house and not have too much waste. Here I'm turning my dress form right side out, and then I'm inserting the 2 layers of sponges into the neck and just making sure that all of the seams are lying flat and that the fabric looks nice and smooth. And we're almost at the finish line now, so next it's time to make the cover for the base. These pieces are stitched along the center and around the little curve, making sure to clip well into the curve and corners, and then turning them right side out and pressing. Then the zippers are attached so that they secure the 2 pieces of the base cover together and allow it to open from the center. Here I'm just using my craft scissors to trim off the excess zipper ends. That part is going to get caught up in the seam allowance at the base of the dress form. And then attaching the base was a little bit tricky because it's another curved piece. So what I did was I opened up the zippers of the base cover and then slipped the dress form inside so that the right sides were together. And then I was able to pin around the seam from the outside of the base cover, matching up all of the notches. And I did find while doing this that my zippers didn't align perfectly with the side seams, and thinking back, I'm wondering if that's because I accidentally attached it backwards, although I think I did try it both ways. But other than that, all of the other notches lined up perfectly, and in the end I think it turned out fine. But just make sure that when you're clipping your notches and marking your pattern pieces, you're differentiating between the front and the back, which is something that I should have done, just so that it's easier to tell which is which. So now the actual dress form cover is complete, and the only thing left to do is cut the pipe to size and make the stand. So the pattern includes the pipe length and total stand height on the pipe sleeve pattern piece, and this is where my partner came in to help. So he cut the pipe for me to length, and then I went ahead and inserted that into the pipe sleeve of the dress form before stuffing it with my polyester fill. I made sure to stuff the dress form quite stiffly and also took measurements along the way to make sure that all of the measurements were aligning with my actual body measurements. So the filling can be adjusted and you can add more or remove some to get your perfect fit. And then I just tried to make sure that it was as smooth as possible and that there were no lumps or gaps in the stuffing. Then I inserted the cardboard base and pulled the fringes from the pipe cover through the center hole and attached them to the cardboard using some hot glue. If after this point you still need to add some stuffing, you can do that through the holes on the side. And then after that, my dress form was pretty much done. My partner cut the rod to size for me and then also made a stand. And here is what the finished product looks like. Okay, so if you've watched the video up to this point and didn't just skip ahead, then I think you'll have a pretty good idea of the amount of work that went into making this. I was really impressed with the pattern, especially since it's like automatically generated. Everything lined up perfectly. The most difficult parts that I found to construct were definitely like the circular areas around the neck and the armholes. Just sewing circles in general is difficult. That said, I would say that I'm like an intermediate to advanced sewer at this point, and I would definitely say that this project is for an intermediate sewer or above. So if you're a beginner and you're just starting out, I don't know that I would recommend tackling something like this, just because there are some difficult areas and kind of like the overall general level of precision that's needed in this project is quite high. Because you want to make sure that all of the measurements and everything are as exact as possible, all of the lines and everything line up, just to make sure that it's as close as possible to your actual body. Also, there were some areas of the instructions that were a little bit bare bones and involved a little bit of guesswork on my part. So having a lot of previous sewing experience under my belt really helped me sort of figure out what they wanted me to do in those areas. Whereas if I didn't have all of that experience, I probably would have been a little bit confused at some of the points. But yeah, other than that, I actually thought that it came together a lot easier than I expected. It took me about a week to make, which is probably longer than my typical projects, but at the same time, I've never made anything like this before, and I was also filming the process, which adds a lot of time and like extra thinking into the equation. And I'm really happy with the result. It's definitely not perfect, but I think overall it looks pretty good, and I'm definitely proud to say that I made it myself. The caveat to that is that I don't really have anything to compare it to. I don't have a professional dress form, so it's hard for me to look at this and say whether it's better or worse than that. And because I just made this, I actually haven't used it to like do any draping or anything like that yet. So if you would be interested in like a follow-up video, maybe a couple weeks or months down the road after I've actually gotten some use out of it, and like a future follow-up review, then let me know in the comments. Okay, now let's talk costs. So I have my little list here of all of the supplies that I had to purchase and how much they each cost me. So the pattern itself was $36. The outer fabric and the zippers I was able to find at the thrift store, and that cost me about $10. The muslin fabric that I used as the internal stabilizer was actually muslin that I had already in my stash to use for pattern making. So that actually didn't like cost me anything for this project, but I just threw it in as $5 anyway. It's not very expensive fabric, but I maybe used about half a meter to a meter of that. I spent $70 at Home Depot buying the piping and then the rod for the stand, as well as the sponges for filling the neck. For the stuffing, I bought a big bag of polyester stuffing from Sewing Supply Depot, and that was $40. And I used maybe about 3/4 of the bag. And then the last thing was the interfacing, which I also bought from Sewing Supply Depot. That was $20, but I got quite a few yards of that, and I didn't end up using it all. So all in, this project cost me about $180 to make, give or take a little bit. And I was trying to be really budget friendly with it. I was trying to thrift as much as I could. The biggest things that I spent the most money on were obviously the polyester stuffing. That was $40, and if there was any way for me to find that a little bit cheaper, I think I probably could have gone a little bit more budget friendly with that. Another option for stuffing would have been to use some fabric scraps. I keep all of my fabric scraps, and I'm planning on using them to stuff something or make like a scrappy quilt or something in the future. But I didn't want to use that for this just because I wasn't sure if it was going to end up kind of like lumpy. I wanted like the smoothest and most professional result that I could get. So that's why I opted to buy the stuffing. And then the other area where I spent more money was the stand. I was looking online on like places like Marketplace and Craigslist to find a secondhand coat rack, which is what they recommend to use in the instructions. But I couldn't actually find one secondhand that was less than like $50 or $60. So maybe that's just a factor of like where I live, but all of the like kind of antique coat stands are going for like over $100 secondhand. There was one on Amazon that I could have purchased that was around $20 or $30, so that's an option. But my partner's into woodworking, so we decided to just make one ourselves. And we bought the wooden rod to make the stand, and that was about $7 or $8 a foot, I think, and we bought, I think, 5 or 6 feet. So that was quite costly as well, and probably an area that I could have cut down on the costs. So I think overall it's still less expensive than a lot of the dress forms out there, especially like the top of the line ones, but still quite an expensive project. I was doing some research and found a couple of dress forms that are around like a similar price point, maybe not too much more. So I definitely could have gone with one of those, saved myself a lot of time, spent about the same amount of money, and probably ended up with an even more professional result. Even though I'm really happy with my result, it's obviously handmade, and so it's never going to have that level of like professional finish that you would get from one that's made by a company who produces them in factories and, you know, has a lot more experience making these than I do. However, when I consider the fact that this dress form is made to my exact measurements, I do think that the process overall was worth it compared to buying like more of a standard size dress form, unless you happen to fit exactly into their standard sizes. So I'm like a typical US size 8, but I have a smaller bust than the industry average. I'm also a lot taller, so I'm 174 centimeters tall, which is about 5'8.5" feet. And I also have like a longer torso and shorter legs on average for my height and my size. So all of those little like small intricacies and details that are different about my body are accounted for in this model, whereas they wouldn't be accounted for in a standard size dress form that I purchased from a professional supplier. The only other thing I was thinking is if you can purchase like a custom dress form. I wasn't able to find a company that actually produces them to custom measurements. I did find some adjustable dress forms, but I don't know how well those would work. And then it was kind of weird because you'd have like spacing in between the panels. But I am guessing that if you were able to purchase like a fully custom made dress form, the price would probably be quite a bit higher than what it cost me to make this. This opens up a lot of opportunities for me to use like draping techniques in my pattern making instead of just flat pattern making. And it's also going to be really helpful for me in terms of fitting, because it's just a lot easier to fit a garment on someone else than it is to fit on yourself, obviously. And knowing that this is a more accurate representation of my actual body versus what's commercially available is a huge plus over purchasing one. So at the end of the day, I do think that this project was worth it, especially if you can kind of cut down in some of the areas areas where I maybe overspent a little bit, and definitely so that you can have a dress form that fits your exact shape and size. So if you have access to the materials to make something like this, as well as, you know, the skills and confidence in your sewing abilities, then I would definitely say go for it. But I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments on whether you think it's better to DIY or buy. Also, she doesn't have a name yet, and I feel like she needs one, so give me your suggestions for names in the comments, and then I will pick one and then post it later. So that is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed watching it. If you did, please don't forget to leave this video a thumbs up and also subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more like this in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!